Macbeth.
When a person is asked to tell the story of Macbeth, he can tell two stories. One is of a man called Macbeth who came to the throne of Scotland by a crime in the year of our Lord 1039 and reigned justly and well on the whole for 15 years or more. This story is part of Scottish history. The other story issues from a place called Imagination. It is gloomy and wonderful, and you shall hear it. A year or two before Edward the Confessor began to rule England, a battle was won in Scotland against a Norwegian king by two generals named Macbeth and Banquo. After the battle, the generals walked together towards Forres in Elginshire, where Duncan, King of Scotland, was awaiting them. While they were crossing a lonely heath, they saw 3 bearded women, sisters, hand in hand, withered in appearance and wild in their attire.
"Speak! Who are you?"
demanded Macbeth. "Hail, Macbeth, chieftain of Glamis," said the first woman. "Hail, Macbeth, chieftain of Cawdor," said the second woman. "Hail, Macbeth, king that is to be," said the third woman. Then Banquo asked,
"What of me?"
And the third woman replied, "Thou shalt be the father of kings."
"Tell me more,"
said Macbeth.
"By my father's death I am chieftain of Glamis, but the chieftain of Cawdor lives, and the king lives, and his children live. Speak, I charge you."
The women replied only by vanishing, as though suddenly mixed with the air. Banquo and Macbeth knew then that they had been addressed by witches, and were discussing their prophecies when 2 nobles approached. One of them thanked Macbeth in the king's name for his military services, and the other said,
"He bade me call you chieftain of Cawdor."
Macbeth then learned that the man who had yesterday borne that title was to die for treason, and he could not help thinking,
"The third witch called me king that is to be." "Banquo,"
he said,
"you see that the witches spoke truth concerning me. Do you not believe, therefore, that your child and grandchild will be kings?"
Banquo frowned. Duncan had 2 sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, and he deemed it disloyal to hope that his son Fleance should rule Scotland. He told Macbeth that the witches might have intended to tempt them both into villainy by their prophecies concerning the throne. Macbeth, however, thought the prophecy that he should be king too pleasant to keep to himself, and he mentioned it to his wife in a letter. Lady Macbeth was the granddaughter of a king of Scotland who had died in defending his crown against the king who preceded Duncan, and by whose order her only brother was slain. To her, Duncan was a reminder of bitter wrongs. Her husband had royal blood in his veins, and when she read his letter, she was determined that he should be king. When a messenger arrived to inform her that Duncan would pass a night in Macbeth's castle, she nerved herself for a very base action. She told Macbeth almost as soon as she saw him that Duncan must spend a sunless morrow. She meant that Duncan must die, and that the dead are blind.
"We will speak further,"
said Macbeth uneasily, and at night, with his memory full of Duncan's kind words, he would fain have spared his guest. "Would you live a coward?" demanded Lady Macbeth, who seems to have thought that morality and cowardice were the same.
"I dare do all that may become a man,"
replied Macbeth.
"Who dare do more is none."
"Why did you write that letter to me?" she inquired fiercely, and with bitter words she egged him on to murder, and with cunning words she showed him how to do it. After supper, Duncan went to bed, and 2 grooms were placed on guard at his bedroom door. Lady Macbeth caused them to drink wine till they were stupefied. She then took their daggers and would have killed the king herself if his sleeping face had not looked like her father's. Macbeth came later and found the daggers lying by the grooms. and soon with red hands he appeared before his wife, saying,
Methought I heard a voice cry, Sleep no more, Macbeth destroys the sleeping.
Wash your hands, said she. Why did you not leave the daggers by the grooms? Take them back, and smear the grooms with blood.
I dare not,
said Macbeth. His wife dared, and she returned to him with hands red as his own, but a heart less white, she proudly told him, for she scorned his fear. The murderers heard a knocking, and Macbeth wished it was a knocking which could wake the dead. It was the knocking of Macduff, the chieftain of Fife, who had been told by Duncan to visit him early. Macbeth went to him and showed him the door of the king's room. Macduff entered and came out again crying,
Oh, horror! Horror! Horror!
Macbeth appeared as horror-stricken as Macduff, and pretending that he could not bear to see life in Duncan's murderers, he slew the two grooms with their own daggers before they could proclaim their innocence. These murders did not shriek out, and Macbeth was crowned at Scone. One of Duncan's sons went to Ireland, the other to England. Macbeth was king, but he was discontented. The prophecy concerning Banquo oppressed his mind. If Fleance were to rule, a son of Macbeth would not rule. Macbeth determined, therefore, to murder both Banquo and his son Fleance. He hired two ruffians who slew Banquo one night when he was on his way with Fleance to a banquet which Macbeth was giving to his nobles. Fleance escaped. Meanwhile, Macbeth and his queen received their guests very graciously, and he expressed a wish for them which has been uttered thousands of times since his day.
Now, good digestion, wait on appetite, and health on both. We pray your majesty to sit with us,
said Lennox, a Scotch noble. But ere Macbeth could reply, the ghost of Banquo entered the banqueting hall and sat in Macbeth's place. Not noticing the ghost, Macbeth observed that if Banquo were present, he could say that he had collected, under his roof, the choicest chivalry of Scotland. Macduff, however, had curtly declined his invitation. The king was again pressed to take a seat, and Lennox, to whom Banquo's ghost was invisible, showed him the chair where it sat. But Macbeth, with his eyes of genius, saw the ghost. He saw it like a form of mist and blood, and he demanded passionately,
Which of you have done this?
Still none saw the ghost but he, and to the ghost Macbeth said,
Thou canst not say I did it.
The ghost glided out, and Macbeth was impudent enough to raise a glass of wine.
To the general joy of the whole table, and to our dear friend Banquo, whom we miss.
The toast was drunk as the ghost of Banquo entered for the second time.
Begone!
Cried Macbeth.
You are senseless, mindless. Hide in the earth, thou horrible shadow.
Again, none saw the ghost but he.
What is it your majesty sees?
Asked one of the nobles. The queen dared not permit an answer to be given to this question. She hurriedly begged her guests to quit a sick man who was likely to grow worse if he was obliged to talk. Macbeth, however, was well enough next day to converse with the witches whose prophecies had so depraved him. He found them in a cavern on a thunderous day. They were revolving round a cauldron in which were boiling particles of many strange and horrible creatures, and they knew he was coming before he arrived.
Answer me what I ask you,
said the king. Would you rather hear it from us or our masters? Asked the first witch.
Call them,
replied Macbeth. Thereupon the witches poured blood into the cauldron and grease into the flame that licked it, and a helmeted head appeared with the visor on, so that Macbeth could only see its eyes. He was speaking to the head when the first witch said gravely, He knows thy thought. And a voice in the head said,
Macbeth, beware Macduff, the chieftain of Fife.
The head then descended into the cauldron till it disappeared.
One word more,
pleaded Macbeth. "He will not be commanded," said the first witch, and then a crowned child ascended from the cauldron, bearing a tree in his hand. The child said,
Macbeth shall be unconquerable till the wood of Burnham climbs Dunsinane Hill.
That will never be,
said Macbeth, and he asked to be told if Banquo's descendants would ever rule Scotland. The cauldron sank into the earth, music was heard, and a procession of phantom kings filed past Macbeth. Behind them was Banquo's ghost. In each king, Macbeth saw a likeness to Banquo, and he counted 8 kings. Then he was suddenly left alone. His next proceeding was to send murderers to Macduff's castle. They did not find Macduff, and asked Lady Macduff where he was. She gave a stinging answer, and her questioner called Macduff a traitor.
"Thou liest!" shouted
Macduff's little son, who was immediately stabbed and with his last breath entreated his mother to fly. The murderers did not leave the castle while one of its inmates remained alive. Macduff was in England listening, with Malcolm, to a doctor's tale of cures wrought by Edward the Confessor, when his friend Ross came to tell him that his wife and children were no more. At first, Ross dared not speak the truth, and turn Macduff's bright sympathy with sufferers relieved by royal virtue into sorrow and hatred. But when Malcolm said that England was sending an army into Scotland against Macbeth, Ross blurted out his news, and Macduff cried,
"All dead, did you say? All my pretty ones and their mother? Did you say all?"
His sorry hope was in revenge, but if he could have looked into Macbeth's castle on Dunsinane Hill, he would have seen at work a force more solemn than revenge. Retribution was working, for Lady Macbeth was mad. She walked in her sleep amid ghastly dreams. She was wont to wash her hands for a quarter of an hour at a time, but after all her washing would still see a red spot of blood upon her skin. It was pitiful to hear her cry that all the perfumes of Arabia could not sweeten her little hand.
"Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased?" inquired
Macbeth of the doctor, but the doctor replied that his patient must minister to her own mind. This reply gave Macbeth a scorn of medicine.
"Throw physic to the dogs," he said. "I'll none of it."
One day he heard the sound of women crying. An officer approached him and said,
"The Queen, your Majesty, is dead." "Out, brief candle,"
muttered Macbeth, meaning that life was like a candle, at the mercy of a puff of air. He did not weep. He was too familiar with death. Presently, a messenger told him that he saw Birnam Wood on the march. Macbeth called him a liar and a slave, and threatened to hang him if he had made a mistake.
"If you are right, you can hang me,"
he said. From the turret windows of Dunsinane Castle, Birnam Wood did indeed appear to be marching. Every soldier of the English army held aloft a bough which he had cut from a tree in that wood, and like human trees, they climbed Dunsinane Hill. Macbeth had still his courage. He went to battle, to conquer or die, and the first thing he did was to kill the English general's son in single combat. Macbeth then felt that no man could fight him and live, and when Macduff came to him blazing for revenge, Macbeth said to him,
"Go back. I have spilt too much of your blood already." "My voice is in my sword,"
replied Macduff, and hacked at him and bade him yield.
"I will not yield,"
said Macbeth, but his last hour had struck. He fell. Macbeth's men were in retreat when Macduff came before Malcolm, holding a king's head by the hair.
"Hail, King!"
he said, and the new king looked at the old. So Malcolm reigned after Macbeth, but in years that came afterwards, the descendants of Banquo were kings.
The Tempest. Prospero, the Duke of Milan, was a learned and studious man who lived among his books, leaving the management of his dukedom to his brother Antonio, in whom indeed he had complete trust. But that trust was ill-rewarded, for Antonio wanted to wear the duke's crown himself, and, to gain his ends, would have killed his brother but for the love the people bore him. However, with the help of Prospero's great enemy, Alonso, King of Naples, he managed to get into his hands the dukedom with all its honor, power, and riches. For they took Prospero to sea, and when they were far away from land, forced him into a little boat with no tackle, mast, or sail. In their cruelty and hatred, they put his little daughter, Miranda, not yet 3 years old, into the boat with him, and sailed away, leaving them to their fate. But one among the courtiers with Antonio was true to his rightful master, Prospero. To save the duke from his enemies was impossible, but much could be done to remind him of a subject's love. So, this worthy lord, whose name was Gonzalo, secretly placed in the boat some fresh water, provisions, and clothes, and what Prospero valued most of all, some of his precious books. The boat was cast on an island, and Prospero and his little one landed in safety. Now, this island was enchanted, and for years had lain under the spell of a fell witch, Sycorax, who had imprisoned in the trunks of trees all the good spirits she found there. She died shortly before Prospero was cast on those shores, but the spirits, of whom Ariel was the chief, still remained in their prisons. Prospero was a great magician, for he had devoted himself almost entirely to the study of magic during the years in which he allowed his brother to manage the affairs of Milan. By his art he set free the imprisoned spirits, yet kept them obedient to his will, and they were more truly his subjects than his people in Milan had been. For he treated them kindly as long as they did his bidding, and he exercised his power over them wisely and well. One creature alone he found it necessary to treat with harshness. This was Caliban, the son of the wicked old witch, a hideous deformed monster, horrible to look on, and vicious and brutal in all his habits. When Miranda was grown up into a maiden, sweet and fair to see, it chanced that Antonio and Alonso, with Sebastian his brother, and Ferdinand his son, were at sea together with old Gonzalo, and their ship came near Prospero's island. Prospero, knowing they were there, raised by his art a great storm, so that even the sailors on board gave themselves up for lost. And first among them all, Prince Ferdinand leaped into the sea, and, as his father thought in his grief, was drowned. But Ariel brought him safe ashore, and all the rest of the crew, although they were washed overboard, were landed unhurt in different parts of the island, and the good ship herself, which they all thought had been wrecked, lay at anchor in the harbor whither Ariel had brought her. Such wonders could Prospero and his spirits perform. While yet the tempest was raging, Prospero showed his daughter the brave ship laboring in the trough of the sea, and told her that it was filled with living human beings like themselves. She, in pity of their lives, prayed him who had raised this storm to quell it. Then her father bade her to have no fear, for he intended to save every one of them. Then, for the first time, he told her the story of his life and hers, and that he had caused this storm to rise in order that his enemies, Antonio and Alonso, who were on board, might be delivered into his hands. When he had made an end of his story, he charmed her into sleep, for Ariel was at hand, and he had work for him to do. Ariel, who longed for his complete freedom, grumbled to be kept in drudgery, but on being threateningly reminded of all the sufferings he had undergone when Sycorax ruled in the land, and of the debt of gratitude he owed to the master who had made those sufferings to end, he ceased to complain, and promised faithfully to do whatever Prospero might command.
"Do so,"
said Prospero,
"and in 2 days I will discharge thee."
And then he bade Ariel take the form of a water nymph, and sent him in search of the young prince. And Ariel, invisible to Ferdinand, hovered near him, singing the while,
"Come unto these yellow sands, and then take hands, curtsied when you have, and kissed the wild waves whist, footed featly here and there, and sweet sprites the burden bear."
And Ferdinand followed the magic singing, as the song changed to a solemn air, and the words brought grief to his heart and tears to his eyes, for thus they ran.
"Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell, hark! Now I hear them, ding-dong bell."
And so singing, Ariel led the spellbound prince into the presence of Prospero and Miranda. Then, behold, all happened as Prospero desired, for Miranda, who had never, since she could first remember, seen any human being save her father, looked on the youthful prince with reverence in her eyes and love in her secret heart. "I might call him," she said, "a thing divine, for nothing natural I ever saw so noble." And Ferdinand, beholding her beauty with wonder and delight, exclaimed,
"Most sure the goddess on whom these airs attend."
Nor did he attempt to hide the passion which she inspired in him, for scarcely had they exchanged half a dozen sentences before he vowed to make her his queen if she were willing. But Prospero, though secretly delighted, pretended wrath.
"You come here as a spy,"
he said to Ferdinand.
"I will manacle your neck and feet together, and you shall feed on fresh-water mussels, withered roots and husk, and have sea-water to drink. Follow." "No,"
said Ferdinand, and drew his sword. But on the instant Prospero charmed him so that he stood there like a statue, still as stone, and Miranda, in terror, prayed her father to have mercy on her lover. But he harshly refused her and made Ferdinand follow him to his cell. There he set the prince to work, making him remove thousands of heavy logs of timber and piled them up. And Ferdinand patiently obeyed, and thought his toil all too well repaid by the sympathy of the sweet Miranda. She, in very pity, would have helped him in his hard work, but he would not let her, yet he could not keep from her the secret of his love, and she, hearing it, rejoiced and promised to be his wife. Then Prospero released him from his servitude, and glad at heart he gave his consent to their marriage.
"Take her,"
he said.
"She is thine own."
In the meantime, Antonio and Sebastian, in another part of the island, were plotting the murder of Alonso, the King of Naples, for Ferdinand being dead, as they thought, Sebastian would succeed to the throne on Alonso's death. And they would have carried out their wicked purpose while their victim was asleep, but that Ariel woke him in good time. Many tricks did Ariel play them. Once he set a banquet before them, and just as they were going to fall to, he appeared to them amid thunder and lightning in the form of a harpy, and immediately the banquet disappeared. Then Ariel upbraided them with their sins and vanished too. Prospero, by his enchantments, drew them all to the grove without his cell, where they waited, trembling and afraid, and now at last bitterly repenting them of their sins. Prospero determined to make one last use of his magic power.
"And then,"
said he,
"I'll break my staff, and deeper than did ever plummet sound I'll drown my book."
So he made heavenly music to sound in the air, and appeared to them in his proper shape as the Duke of Milan. Because they repented, he forgave them, and told them the story of his life, since they had cruelly committed him and his baby daughter to the mercy of wind and waves. Alonso, who seemed sorriest of them all for his past crimes, lamented the loss of his heir. But Prospero drew back a curtain and showed them Ferdinand and Miranda playing at chess. Great was Alonso's joy to greet his loved son again, and when he heard that the fair maid with whom Ferdinand was playing was Prospero's daughter, and that the young folks had plighted their troth, he said,
"Give me your hands. Let grief and sorrow still embrace his heart that doth not wish you joy."
So all ended happily. The ship was safe in the harbor, and the next day they all set sail for Naples, where Ferdinand and Miranda were to be married. Ariel gave them calm seas and auspicious gales, and many were the rejoicings at the wedding. Then Prospero, after many years of absence, went back to his own dukedom, where he was welcomed with great joy by his faithful subjects. He practiced the arts of magic no more, but his life was happy, and not only because he had found his own again, but chiefly because, when his bitterest foes who had done him deadly wrong lay at his mercy, he took no vengeance on them, but nobly forgave them. As for Ariel, Prospero made him free as air, so that he could wander where he would, and sing with a light heart his sweet song.
Where the bee sucks, there suck I. In a cowslip's bell I lie. There I couch when owls do cry. On the bat's back I do fly. After summer, merrily, merrily, merrily shall I live now, under the blossom that hangs on the bough.